Hello everyone, my name's Adam and today we're going to be sewing up my new pattern, the Baker Boy cap. I've designed it myself and you can purchase it following the link in the description below. So the Baker Boy cap, it's got 8 different panelled pieces making it a nice full cap, a stiffened peak, a concealed band, it's fully lined and finished with a nice self-covered button and a snap fastening on the front. Included in the pattern, you've got a full instructional sheet, you've got the pattern sheet itself, and we're actually supplying the plastic peak to go in it as well, which is quite handy. You need about ½ metre of fabric, that's more than enough for your main fabric, ½ metre of fabric for your lining and some fusible interfacing as well. And fabrics that you could make it out of, you could go for a nice wool, a nice tweed if you wanted to. I'm going to be making it out of denim today, but the options and possibilities are endless. And also for the lining, a nice silk or maybe just a polyester lining or cotton will suffice. And then sizing, we've got this in 5 different sizes going right up to an extra large, so make sure you measure your circumference of your head and pick the right size for you. So that's all about the hat. Let's get cutting it out and sewing it. So you've got all of your pieces cut out for your Baker Boy cap now. I'm going to start sewing the main body of the hat itself. So taking 2 of the crown panels, we're going to sew these up in pairs each time. As you can see, they're nicely interfaced. So with right sides together, we're going to match those up nicely. And because the pieces are identical, they should match up perfectly. And then all I'm going to do is just stick a couple of pins into the seam that we're going to be sewing, because we're going to be sewing all the way down this side here at 1 centimetre seam allowance. So now I've got some pins in, let's take it to the machine and sew that seam. So now we've got the 2 crown panel pieces pinned together. I'm going to put it under the machine, sewing at 1 centimetre seam allowance. So we're just going to lower the foot and we're going to sew forwards and then do a couple of reverse stitches. There your reverse stitches. Now we're going to continue to sew the curve at 1 centimetre seam allowance. At this point you might find that you just have to raise the foot and pivot the piece and then lower the foot back down, being sure to take out any pins as you go. Okay, let's sew the curve 1 centimetre seam allowance. And then just some tacking stitches at the end there, some back stitches, and then cut your threads, lift your presser foot, and you've got the seam sewn. So now we've neatly sewn down one side to make that a pair. We've got it joined at the seam with a nice 1 centimetre seam allowance all the way down the edge. The next stage then is going to be to clip into this curve, and that's just to allow the fabric to ease out, and then we're going to press that seam using a tailor's ham. Once we've pressed the seam and clipped the curve, then we're going to top stitch. We're going to top stitch parallel to the seam that we've just sewn. So once you've sewn the seam at 1 centimetre seam allowance, then we're going to just clip into the curve just to allow the fabric to ease. Just be careful that you don't snip into the stitching line. And I'm just using some embroidery scissors here. And you'll see what that does is just allows that curve to ease. Then what you're going to do is press the seam allowance open using a tailor's ham just to help with that shape. Press all of this open, nice and flat, and then we'll go back to the machine and top stitch parallel on the other side. So making sure that your seam allowances are now lying flat, we're going to top stitch. So I'm going to put it under the machine and just lower my presser foot. Now, I've come up with a little bit of a trick to get this nice and straight and parallel, and that is to offset my needle. On this machine it's stitch number 5 and it'll take it over to the left. So I can centre the seam down the centre of the foot, and the top stitching will sew parallel and equidistant to it on both sides. It's just about finding that reference point. If you haven't got that, then it's finding a reference point on your machine foot. Okay, so we're just going to do some locking stitches at the beginning, and then making sure that the seam allowance is lying flat underneath. We're just going to top stitch down this side, following the seam line. Just take your time, nice and slowly on this, and I'm just pulling apart slightly so that the fabric along that curve is going to lie correctly. And that was all part of putting those clips into that curved seam. Just get to the end there, and I'm just going to do some locking stitches again. You don't really want to back stitch on a top stitch, so you could potentially tie those ends off as well. Snip the threads, lift the foot, and then we're just going to repeat the same down the other side. So again, because my needle's offset, I'm just lining the seam line up with my foot, and then I'm going to lower the presser foot. I'm going to do some locking stitches, and then making sure that that seam allowance is lying flat. It should be, because you pressed it. You're going to stitch using that seam line as a guide. Some locking stitches to finish with, and then trim the threads. And there you have a nice top stitched seam, parallel on both sides, and it just helps it hold that shape, which gives the fullness of the Baker Boy cap. So once you've clipped the curve of the seam and pressed the seam allowance open, and then top stitched along that line for a nice decorative effect, you'll end up with something that looks like this. Now top stitching along that line, that seam line, is just going to help it hold its shape, and I've done it on both sides, just a little bit away from the seam line. Once you've done that, you're then going to repeat it with the remaining pieces. So you'll have 4 pieces that look like this. Essentially what you've got then is your hat into quarters. We're now going to make the hat into halves, and it's very much just repeating those same steps. So now we're going to take 2 of the quarters, we're going to line them up there. Again, like we did initially, we're going to put some pins in just to keep it nice and sturdy and in position. Put it onto the machine. We're going to sew that seam now, again at 1 centimetre seam allowance. You're going to clip the curve, press the seam allowance open, and top stitch to match the 2 pieces that we've already got there. You'll have half of the hat there then, and you'll do the same for the other half of the hat, and then join the whole hat together. So once you've got the quarters made up, we're now going to sew 2 of them together to make half of the cap. So I've pinned those pieces together, and we're just going to sew along that curve again at 1 centimetre seam allowance. So my foot's down, and I'm going to do some reverse stitches as well at the beginning. I'm sewing from the bottom of the crown panel every time. And then we get to this point and we just have to lift the foot and pivot. Now I'm taking it to the very center seam line here. My needle's bang in the middle of that seam line there now. So once I get to that part, I'm just going to do some reverse stitches and then cut my threads. And there we have it. All that's left to do now is to again top stitch in the same fashion as we've done with the other pieces, making sure to clip and press open the seam allowance. So here you can see we've got half of the Baker Boy cap. Similarly, we've top stitched all of the seams with the seam allowance lying flat underneath because they've been pressed and the curves clipped. You're going to do exactly the same with the remaining pieces, so then you'll be left with 2 halves of the cap, and then in the same fashion you're going to sew together the 2 halves, clipping the curves, pressing the seam allowances and top stitching parallel to the seam lines. So once you've sewn up the quarters, you'll have 2 halves of a hat. Then what you've got to do is sew those together in exactly the same fashion that we've sewn all of the segments together so far. And then you'll end up with that main outer piece completed. We're going to do that bit off camera and we'll be right back to show you the next steps. So that's what it will look like when all of the 8 crown pieces and panels are sewn together, and my Juki machine's done a lovely job of just top stitching all of those seams there. So that's the main body of the hat completed. So once you have the main body of the cap sewn up, you're then going to take your lining pieces. Now these pieces are exactly the same shape as the crown panels. You'd have cut 8 out of the lining and sew them up just like this in the same fashion that you've sewn the main body of the cap. Making sure you clip all of your curves, press your seam allowances open using a tailor's ham. The only thing I've omitted on the lining is I've not done any top stitching on this. There's no need to do any top stitching parallel to the seam line. You can do if you want to, but there's no reason to for the lining at this point. So there it is. That's the lining ready to go into the main cap. So once you've got the main body of the hat, the crown panel sewed up along with the lining, it's time to prepare the other elements in the cap. And the first one we're going to talk about now is the concealed band. As you can see, it's a long rectangle. Make sure it's interfaced. That was one of the stages at the beginning. And we're going to make sure that we've pressed it in half lengthways. So it will look like that. What we're then going to do, once we've put that pressed fold line in, is with right sides together, match the 2 shortest sides, stick a little pin in if you want to, just like that, and then we're going to sew this seam at 1 centimetre seam allowance and then trim away into the seam allowance to remove any bulk. So now we're ready to prepare the band. I've got the 2 shortest sides pinned together with the right sides together, and we're just going to sew at 1 centimetre seam allowance down there. So we lower the foot and then we'll do some reverse stitches at beginning and end as well. There we go. So now we've sewn that 1 centimetre seam allowance. All we're going to do is trim that seam allowance right down to the stitching line to reduce any bulk. So just taking my scissors, I'm going to do that here. You want to press that nice and flat as well. And then once you've done that, you want to make sure you put it back together in that fashion along that fold line we created when we pressed it in half lengthways, because that is now your band ready to go into your hat. So next up is to prepare the peak. Now this can be the tricky bit, but just to recap, we should have a couple of pieces. We've got one piece which will sit underneath the peak, and that's the peak that isn't interfaced, the piece that isn't interfaced, and we've got one piece that is interfaced, and that will sit on top of the peak. We've also supplied in the pattern the plastic peak, and it looks like this. It's quite flexible, and the good thing about that is if your machine does go through it at this point, it's not going to be disastrous. The needle will go through it. We don't advise it, but it's safe to use on the machine. So what we're going to do is take with right sides together peak pieces, and you're just going to put a couple of pins. It's always advised to pin particularly this part because it's a curved seam. So a couple of pins in there with right sides together, and then what you're going to do, looks like a smile, doesn't it? You're going to sew along that outside edge. Okay, so that longest outside curve at 1 centimetre seam allowance. Once you've done that and sewn that outside curve at 1 centimetre seam allowance, you're then going to clip the curve like we did with the main body of the cap. That's just to spread the ease of the fabric, and then we're going to understitch this piece, and we'll see that when we're at the sewing machine. So now we're going to prepare the peak. I've got the two peak pieces together with right sides together and got it pinned all along this outside curve. We're going to sew the outside curve at 1 centimetre seam allowance. Starting at the beginning, lower the foot, and let's sew at 1 centimetre seam allowance. So there we have it sewn now. What we're going to do is turn this to the right side. We're going to understitch. Now this bit can be a bit tricky. So you want to turn the seam allowance towards the non-interfaced piece. So you see how the seam allowance is going in that direction? That's the way it needs to sit underneath the machine. So we're going to put it under the machine, and then we're going to lower the presser foot, and we're going to sew as close to the seam as possible on the non-interface side, making sure that the seam allowance is in the direction towards that end of the sewing machine, towards the non-interface piece. Do a couple of back stitches, and this is where it might get a little bit tricky, just making sure that everything is in the right direction and just pulling that apart slightly just so we get it nicely understitched. Stitching as closely as you can to that seam, just take time. All the while with my thumbs I'm just making sure that I'm moving that seam allowance towards the non-interface side so it catches underneath. Couple of back stitches at the end. And as you'll see, what that does now is it will encourage the piece that is effectively aligning the piece that will sit underneath the peak to stay. And once that's had a nice press, it'll give you a nice finished curve line there. So the stitching will be underneath the peak. That's done a fantastic job there. So that just needs a nice press. So once you've understitched your peak piece and given it a nice press, you're then going to take the plastic peak. You're going to insert it into that pocket that you've just made with those curved pieces. Now this is very important. You need to make sure that the seam allowance sits towards the underneath where you understitched. It's probably quite difficult to see, but that seam allowance needs to sit underneath there. Once you've got it sat in place all the way around, you're then going to pop in some pins to make sure that's nice and taut, matching the top up together. I start in the middle generally, one in the middle and then one at both ends. And because this is a curve, you'll get this moving slightly, so you just have to manipulate it around in the right way, and you'll find that as you're sewing it as well. Okay. So the plastic peak is now inside and I've pinned it. Now we're going to sew a 1 centimetre seam allowance all the way around this inner curve. Now you want to be careful that you're not catching the plastic. However, it's thin enough that if you do, it's not going to cause a hazard or a problem. But you want to make sure you're getting as close to it and as tight to it as possible. Now if you have a zipper foot on your machine, you may want to use that at this point because it will allow you to potentially just get that little bit closer. Depends what you feel comfortable with, but that'd be my top tip, to use a zipper foot. I'm just going to use my normal foot today and get this sewn in, ready to be basted to the cap. So I've got the peak underneath the machine, the plastic's in there. We're going to sew it 1 centimetre seam allowance all of the way around. We'll back stitch at the beginning. You can actually hear on my machine that it's catching that plastic there, which proves it's not a big issue. It will go through, especially if you're using a nice heavy needle like a denim needle. All the while making sure that the fabric is being pulled nice and taut this way, still staying at 1 centimetre seam allowance. That's really important, just to take your time on this bit. And these stitches are just going to secure it in place. At the halfway mark there. Making sure we're turning as we go. Good. And you can actually feel where that peak is as well, so that'll help. And then just back stitch. You've got that peak sewn in place. That's just going to help it stay there for when we baste it and sew it to the cap. So here you can see we've got it prepared. We've pinned the lining inside the main cap. Now it's important that you remember that you are pinning this together with wrong sides together. So there we are, and all you're going to do is pin and match the seams. So as you can see here, the seam of the main cap matches the seam of the lining. You're going to do that all the way around, and then we will be sewing and basting that lining to the main cap, this time at 0.5 centimeters or 5 millimeters away from the edge. So I've removed the free arm on my juking machine, so I can just sew this a little bit easier, and we're going to sew at 0.5 centimeters seam allowance. We're just going to baste it. So I'm going to lengthen my stitch for a basting stitch, around about 3.5. No back tacking required. So all that's done now is secured the lining to the main hat. So I've just pinned in place the peak to the main cap. Now the lining is basted in there as well. What you need to do is make sure that you've notched the peak, and that notation is on the pattern as well. And you're going to take that center notch and match it with a center seam on the hat. So I've matched those, I've pinned them in, and we're now going to baste the peak in place. And to do that, all I'm going to do is baste it on the machine following the existing stitching line that we've got on the peak. So that's at a centimeter seam allowance. Things also to note is to make sure that these ends here manipulated and sitting that side of the cap. You don't want them to not get caught. They need to be caught well in. So baste those in on both sides, so they're sitting that side. Let's go to the machine and baste it in. Okay, so we're ready now to baste the peak in place. So I've got my foot down, my needle down. I'm just following that existing stitching line at 1 centimeter. Taking my pins out as I go. You can see this is the trickiest bit, so just take your time, and all of this basting will be worth it. See that I've got the peak nicely basted in place. So now it's time to insert the concealed band. This band is what's going to be covering all of the raw edges. Now you need to match it at certain points. There's obviously this seam that we created earlier. Well, that's going to be your back seam, so you make sure that you align that with the back seam of the cap. The halfway mark will be the front seam, and then you can even mark it in quarters to mark the quarter seams. Ease it out around the cap and pin it in place like I have done here. What's important to note as well is that all of the raw edges are together, so that when it folds over and it's sewn, everything is concealed. So raw edges together, pin it in, matching those reference points that I've just mentioned, and when we come to sew it, just making sure that we're extra careful around the peak here and that we're following that curve line, and it'll be grand. So it's time to sew in the band. Okay, so sewing at 1 centimetre seam allowance, I'm starting from the back seam. Again, if you want to use a zipper foot to help you get nearer to the peak when you get to it, that's up to you. I'm just using my standard foot today on my Juki. So here we go then, starting from the back seam at 1 centimetre seam allowance. Don't forget to back tack. Take your pins out as you go. You'll see as we're just approaching, there's that little corner bit of the peak. You want it that side of the band so it's catching in. You know that way you're catching in everything in the peak. Taking it nice and slowly. Back tack to finish off, and there we have the band in place. So once you've sewn the band into the cap, you'll have these raw edges in here. You just need to neaten those and trim as close to the stitching line as you dare to reduce any bulk. So once you've trimmed all of that down, you're then going to turn and press the band towards the inside. That's going to conceal all of the raw edges, as you can see it's doing there already. Then what you're going to do is by hand make some slip stitches, an invisible stitch all the way around, just catching the lining and the band, being sure not to catch the outer cap. Then you're going to want to add a button. I suggest using a self-covered button, and you could do one to contrast or you could do one in the same fabric, and there's plenty of tutorials out there to show how to do a covered button, but you'll end up with something much like this. There it is. And if you want to, you can add that snap fastening to the front as well. You just add the snap fastening to the front peak and the front of the cap, so that can snap in place there. Other than that, you're done. There we are, we've got our hats, and if the cap fits, they say wear it. So thank you very much for joining me for my pattern. Don't forget you can buy it using the details in the description below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and hope you enjoy sewing my Baker Boy cap pattern. Happy sewing!